Hello, I'm Ellen Binns, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the United States. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of those regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. As we record, it's May 21st, 2024. Today, we're going to talk about Africa and Africa Day, which is Saturday, May 25th. It's the annual commemoration of the foundation of the Organization of African Unity. It's celebrated in various countries on the African continent as well as all around the world. As this day is celebrated, this week, we turn our attention to how Africa as a continent can play a transformative role in the world in the years to come, looking at some of its major challenges it faces, but also very promising opportunities. As always, we hone in with our prayers and intentions that may be focused.
So what is Africa Day? Africa Day commemorates the ideals of pan-Africanism, as it's called. The African Union, AU, its organizing structure, is a continental organization of 55 member states that aims to promote unity and cooperation among African countries and serves as a forum for tackling common challenges such as poverty, conflict, and governance issues. These include achieving greater unity and solidarity among African countries, defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, accelerating political and socio-economic integration, promoting democratic principles and good governance, encouraging international cooperation, and harmonizing policies among existing and future regional economic communities. The Union has achieved much, including establishing the African Peace and Security Architecture, which is a framework to help manage conflicts and crises in the continent, aiming to prevent, manage, and resolve conflicts through various mechanisms like the African Standby Force and the Continental Early Warning System, forming the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is one of the world's largest free trade areas, aimed at creating a single market in Africa, and so boosting inter-African trade, and also in its response to health crises, such as organizing a coordinated African response to health emergencies like Ebola and COVID-19 through the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention.
However, it faces challenges as member countries are plagued by conflict and political instability, while many are among the world's poorest nations, highlighting the challenge of economic inequality. The AU recently secured a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, marking a significant advancement in the organization's global influence, enabling it to contribute directly to shaping international policies that impact the African continent. This admission followed shortly after the BRICS Association welcomed Egypt and Ethiopia as new members alongside Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Argentina. Both events signal Africa's strategic repositioning in global geopolitics.
Its vital role in global politics isn't lost on the major powers. U.S. government policy is typical of many. The Department of State's Bureau of African Affairs saying that it is focused on three core objectives regarding the continent. Firstly, advancing trade and commercial ties with key African states to increase U.S. and African prosperity. Secondly, protecting the United States from cross-border health and security threats. And thirdly, supporting key African states' progress towards stability, citizen-responsive governance, and self-reliance. Meanwhile, China views Africa as a viable alternative source of energy, minerals, and other commodities to fuel its rapid economic growth and industrialization. It aims to cultivate favorable relations with African nations and regional bodies like the African Union to expand its political and economic influence on the continent, and has provided economic aid, loans, and military assistance to many African countries. Russia, too, has sought to expand its geopolitical influence in the continent through sponsoring military security and cooperative diplomacy. African nations have increasingly played a proactive role in international politics. For example, last June, sending a diplomatic mission of leaders from South Africa, Egypt, Senegal, Zambia, Comoros, and representatives from Uganda and Congo to Kyiv and Moscow in an attempt to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia.
I found this hugely interesting that everyone kind of wants a piece of Africa.
They do, yes.
And seeing how each of these major powers has their own little plan makes me want them to get stronger so that they can defend themselves.
Exactly. I think a lot of the influence does depend on what strings are attached, doesn't it? So I think I've read a lot around Chinese investment, very heavy investment in infrastructure and mining and so on, but really expecting a lot in return. And this is really one of the areas perhaps where we might focus our prayers and intentions, that there is, yes, there's always going to be, isn't there, with geopolitics, there's always going to be self-interest involved. But sometimes that self-interest, and perhaps this is part of that US policy, is, well, if we have a stable Africa, we have a stable world, and therefore it's better for global and in turn, obviously, US security as well. So sometimes, the self-interest works in tandem with what can be of interest to the countries. So that's perhaps where we might will most of all. There's this respect for the sovereignty of individual nations. And they've also, of course, a lot of these nations, in fact, probably all of them in Africa, as far as I'm aware, were way back when, 50 years ago, under imperial domination,
right?
European domination. So it's one of the objectives, I understand, of the African Union, or why it was originally established under a different name, albeit, was in response to that. Actually, we are now independent, and we want to declare our independence and move together as cooperative nations. So it would be rather tragic if, the modern day potential imperialists, and I don't know if it's fair to brand China in this way. I think Russia in Congo, particularly at the time the Wagner group was operating, had possibly ambitions there around, establishing a very strong power base. It kind of points back to that era, doesn't it, potentially? And we've got to hope and pray that, and send our intention that doesn't happen. The financial investment, the technological knowledge sharing, trading, and so on is for everybody's interests.
Yes, and the AU becomes strong and stable.
Yes. I have to say as well, I had missed this story recently about the BRICS nation really expanding quite significantly with major economies. So Iran and Saudi Arabia together now in the BRICS, two traditional enemies, but also very important economies, along with, as we were saying, Egypt, and was it Ethiopia as well? I think, joining quite significant. Yeah, United Arab Emirates, Argentina, again, this is a huge, massive economic union now to challenge, as it were, the EU, for example, the American trade organizations. Yeah, that's interesting.
So what challenges is Africa facing as a whole, as we said, for the AU to get stronger? Africa is home to 1.2 billion people, with nearly 2/3 of its population under the age of 30 and 40% under the age of 14. The continent enjoys having the youngest population structure in the world. Such a high number of young people is an opportunity for the continent's growth, especially as the population of other countries is aging. But only if these new generations are fully empowered to realize their best potential. Africa's population is expected to double by 2050, translating into a 50% increase in demand for housing and all that is needed to have a modern household, from electricity and water connections to basic appliances and furniture to municipality services.
Africa is also home to an incredible amount of diverse natural capital, and not just the magnificent animals that most of us might bring to mind when thinking of some of the great open landscapes, such as the Serengeti and the floodplains of the Zambezi and other great rivers. Nearly 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 12% of its oil reserves, and 8% of its natural gas are located in Africa. The continent is also home to 40% of the world's gold reserves, and it boasts the world's largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, uranium, and platinum. In other words, 30% of the Earth's rare earth deposits are in Africa. These elements are central to the global economy, and their importance is rising rapidly, especially in various strategic high-tech industries such as semiconductors, batteries, and green energy. Finally, the continent also possesses 65% of the world's arable land. Incredible, isn't it? Making it central to long-term food production and security.
So, given its natural resources, Africa has the potential to play a significant role in global energy transition and climate mitigation. However, it's highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change like prolonged droughts, floods, cyclones, and environmental degradation. These exacerbate food and water insecurity, increasing health risks, and threaten livelihoods dependent on agriculture and livestock. Addressing the challenges of climate change requires access to technology and financing, supported sustainable development strategies tailored for local need. Ongoing civil conflicts, violence, and armed struggles in various African nations also presents a challenge, leading to the displacement of people and instability. Some conflicts have been driven by competition over dwindling natural resources, while high rates of poverty, malnutrition, and lack of access to basic services like healthcare persist in many African countries. Poor governance, corruption, inefficient public services, and lack of accountability hinder economic progress in some African nations, while intercontinental trade has been frustrated by underdeveloped infrastructure and barriers to private sector growth. Achieving inclusive economic growth, job creation, and sustainable industrialization remain key priorities.
On top of these perennial challenges, a colonial legacy of imposed borders has left many African nations with ethnic divisions, distorted cultural identities, and undemocratic governance structures. Many nations continue to depend on foreign aid, unfair trade terms, and exploitation of resources by external powers. Overcoming these multifaceted challenges will require visionary leadership, good governance, regional integration, and strategic partnerships. Africa needs representation in the decision-making of global forums that affect it directly. While there is a long way to go in making this a reality, African countries are already making their mark on the framing and management of global challenges. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, African states pushed the agenda of equitable distribution of vaccines through the COVAX facility and have continued the fight for equity by pushing for reform of World Trade Organization regulations on intellectual property rights for life-saving medicines. Similarly, in the global response to climate change, they have pushed for matters like climate justice, while in areas of funding, they have put forward proposals on how to reform the global financial architecture to give access to more and better capital and credit, making existing multilateral systems work better for everyone.
The American think tank on international affairs, the Atlantic Council, recognizes Africa's central role in these and other pressing global priorities, saying recently that the world economy now finds itself at a critical juncture, facing a series of extraordinary setbacks that have pushed down growth. Reigniting growth requires a unique combination of targeted policies, robust international cooperation, and a renewed look at the global economy with a particular focus on Africa. Due to its burgeoning and youthful population, abundant natural resources, and a strategic geographical location that can facilitate global trade, Africa can play a major role in and should be front and center of any renewed efforts for revitalizing the global economy. A decade-long, robust, inclusive, and green growth in Africa will not only move hundreds of millions living in the continent out of poverty, but will also accelerate a global rebound and recovery. However, for this to materialize, Africa needs substantial investments in its failing and inadequate physical and social infrastructure.
Wow, it's huge, isn't it?
Yes.
The vital balance to be struck here in recognizing the vital role that Africa plays for the world. Really vital role, not just because of all these minerals and this huge arable land, but in terms of geopolitics, its place in the climate debate with climate justice, absolutely massive in driving, as you know, the Atlantic Council says, the world economy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see that when you understand, like they say, how many resources are there, and the youthful population, where that's about the only place that's happening.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
the future belongs to Africa, it sounds like.
Exactly. The real opportunity, if they are given that opportunity.
However, from what I hear in general from the States, you picture Africa as being a place of conflict, and where, the countries there's so many civil wars going on between each of the areas, and you don't realize the robust potential.
No, clearly there are major conflicts going on and instability and huge problems with drought and so on that, affect many millions in the continent. But there's an awful lot of good news as well. And it's in quite surprising areas. There's some quite big car manufacturers, for example, in a number of African countries, and green energy. And there's quite a lot of tech knowledge. It's not exactly Silicon Valley, but it's got its potential there. So for our intentions, our prayers, where can we go with this? It's around really all countries in the world, isn't it? Having this recognition of Africa's vital role in driving the world economy. And that's got to come down to institutions as well, like the World Bank, which I'm sure they are aware of this, but really taking action and taking, strong decisions that recognize this vital importance. And as seems to be slowly happening in some areas, we've mentioned the UN Security Council now has the African Union on its permanent council, but there's still a need for representation in other areas, like the G20, for example, I would imagine would be another obvious platform where African voices need to be heard more strongly.
Absolutely.
However, great opportunities also exist for Africa and its people, despite the challenges we've mentioned. There are opportunities for sustainable development and economic growth that can benefit the continent and its people. So among these are exploiting Africa's abundant potential for green business ventures across sectors like renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, and the blue economy. Transitioning to sustainable practices like organic farming, precision agriculture, restoring nature, and combating environmental degradation. Encouraging the potential of a large, youthful, and tech-savvy population that can drive innovation and economic growth, and positioning itself as an attractive destination for diversified global supply chains, with its critical mineral reserves, adaptable workforce, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, and not to mention its geographical position in the world. It's quite, well, on my world map, it's right in the middle pretty well. So, yeah, it's well placed there in the midst of major shipping lanes. The continent may tap into its green hydrogen potential and abundant renewable energy resources, particularly solar, to green supply chains. By capitalizing on these opportunities through appropriate policy, the development of infrastructure, skills training, and strategic partnerships, African nations can drive sustainable economic growth, job creation, and in turn improve the livelihoods for their people.
The Atlantic Council foresees great promise for the continent if it is able to address its major infrastructure problems and maintain political stability. They say Africa managed to triple its GDP from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion between 1990 and 2021. Moreover, during the same period, Ethiopia's GDP increased by 7.6 times, while the economies of Ghana and Egypt grew by 5 and 3.7 times respectively. By leveraging the heterogeneity among its 54 economies, Africa can build upon this performance through fostering greater regional trade and labor market integration, increasing climate resilience, and better integrating its labor and commodity markets in the global supply chain. So lots of potential. That's amazing. I had no idea they had increased their GDP that much.
It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Real success stories for some of those economies.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I was surprised, particularly surprised by Ghana. I remember it was probably back in the 1990s, a long time ago. I went to a talk in London. I remember this talk. I might have mentioned it before, actually. On the platform were Bob Geldof and Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General, who was from Ghana originally. And they were two very different personalities. Kofi Annan was the very quiet, thoughtful diplomat, and Bob Geldof, very passionate, obviously, keeps talking, saying very wise words, very knowledgeable, but complete opposite. And it was interesting to see them together. It was quite an interesting dynamic. Both having exactly the same message and purpose, this real desire for, I think actually it was very specifically focused on Africa, this particular talk, and the potential of countries. So this is going back 20 or 30 years. I do remember Kofi Annan saying that his country, Ghana, at the time, he lamented that how, in his view, how little they had developed in the years since independence compared with a country like South Korea, which had really made its mark on the world stage and, become in terms of car and high tech, white goods production, a major exporter. So given that, over the last 25 years, they've clearly turned a corner, and perhaps I think he's passed now, hasn't he, Kofi Annan? But if were he to, were he to know now, perhaps it would bring a smile to his face.
Yeah, hopefully they're getting it together.
Yeah.
Wow.
So in terms of where we might focus our intentions, again, let's will that African nations will see how their efforts and resources can be best applied to build the infrastructure needed to exploit the opportunities available to them, working mindfully in cooperation with overseas partners as appropriate.
And how should we respond to the objectives of Africa Day? Well, where might all this take us with our focus for the intention and prayer? Specifically, we might remind ourselves of some of the key objectives of Africa Day: promoting pan-African unity and solidarity, that is upholding the principle of solidarity and unity among African nations and peoples while freeing themselves from foreign domination. The AU says that this involves supporting initiatives that foster cooperation, collaboration, and collective action among African countries on issues of common interest. And I think this is key. They have to become solid so that they're not subject to being influenced too much by outside forces or become unstable.
Exactly. Defending the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of African nations, while promoting and defending common African positions globally. A response offered by the AU involves increasing African voices in global forums, as we mentioned, on matters especially that impact the continent.
As you said, they need more representation.
Very much so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Promoting peace, security, democracy, and development through assisting efforts to resolve conflicts, counter insecurity, and building democratic institutions. For this, the AU recommends facilitating investments, technology transfer, and partnerships that drive inclusive economic growth, job creation, and sustainable development across the continent, and advocating for policies and actions that address Africa's development challenges like poverty, health crisis, climate change impacts, and food insecurity.
So each one of these seems to offer clear opportunities for our prayers and intentions. My goodness. And let's really hope that this is all very much highlighted, especially on Africa Day, but not just on one day, of course, on the agendas of the foreign offices around the world, really, to really and those international bodies like the G20.
And the think tanks.
And the think tanks, exactly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So, in harmony with the core objectives we've just mentioned that will be celebrated on Africa Day, the AU believes that we can contribute to a vision, we being the AU, of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa that plays an influential role in the global arena. So let us join them in holding that vision as we take for our key focus for our intention this week. We will that the governments of all African nations will continue to recognize the value of deep cooperation and commitment to their participation in the work and objectives of the African Union.
May it be so.
Absolutely.
That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's Daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.